Section 16 of Psychology, the Cognitive Powers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. Psychology, the Cognitive Powers by James McCosh. Book 2nd. The Reproductive or Representative Power. The Association of Ideas, Part 4. Section 2. Secondary Laws. The law of preference, which is the law of native power and active energy. The laws of which I have been speaking seem to me to be those which regulate the train of thought. But the question arises, how is it that the mind is led to follow one of these rather than another? Or why, among a variety of objects which it might follow, does it take one rather than another? I met two persons in a particular company. The next time I fall in with them, I remember the one, but not the other. Why is this? The reason may be that the one of them had a very brilliant conversation, or he committed some great blunder which exposed him to ridicule, or he had a pair of peculiar great eyes, or a limp as he walked. The question now is, can we generalize these reasons? The laws of this kind have been called secondary laws by Brown, and the law of preference by Hamilton. I have a way of my own of stating them. There seem to be two grounds on which the mind turns to one associated object rather than another. The one of these is the ground of native power, taste, and disposition. We are so constituted by nature that our feelings go in one way rather than another. Thus, one mind ever tends to repetition, another rather to correlation. One man delights in poetical images, another in scientific classes or causes. One intellect is inclined to observe resemblances, another differences in exceptions. I cannot illustrate this. It does not bear so much on the practical object I have in view. But I must explain and illustrate the law of mental energy. Those ideas are brought up most readily and frequently on which we have bestowed the greatest amount of mental exertion. Thus it is when we have once and again, in the past, thought or felt about certain objects, they will be apt once and again to come before us in the future. Every mind seems to be endowed with a certain amount of power, and according to the power expended on an idea, so is it remembered for a greater length of time, and it comes up more easily and frequently. I suppose it is because youth has the greatest amount of this energy that the memory is strongest at that period of life, while in consequence of fading strength, old persons feel a little less interest in the objects and events which pass before them, and these, in consequence, leave little impression on their minds. This exertion may be an energy of feeling, of intellect, or of will. 1. In parentheses. Those ideas that have been attended with deep feeling are called up more frequently and readily. I have forgotten many of the events of my childhood, but there are some I can never forget. They were accompanied with such deep emotion. I cannot, for example, forget that solemn Sabbath day in which I saw the corpse of a revered father spread out on the couch on which I had so often played with him. Much that I did and saw in my college days has passed into oblivion, but I cannot banish one scene from my mind. I was passing along the streets when I saw a child literally divided in two by the wheel of a heavily loaded cart passing over it. I got but a momentary glimpse of the scene, of the mother hurrying frantically past me to embrace a mangled corpse instead of a living child. But there it remains painted on my memory, fresh as if it had happened but an hour ago. I do not remember all that I saw in a pedestrian tour which I took in the Highlands of Scotland, but I can never, while I have a memory, forget such scenes as Loch Lomond and the Trossachs. I cannot recall all that I saw in Germany, but I can bring up at pleasure the Unter den Linden of Berlin and the scenes hallowed by the deeds of Luther. If Italy is named, Venice and the plains of Lombardy and the Cathedral of Milan and the Lake of Como come up lively as a picture. I remember much of Switzerland, but I dwell most fondly on the sunrise as seen from the Riffelberg, on the high top of Mont Blanc, flanked with its pointed buttresses, on the huge bulk of the Jungfrau with its deep gullies, and on the placidity of Lake Lucerne, guarded by its horrid mountains of snow and ice. My recollection of Belgium is somewhat flat, but I do not forget Waterloo. Why do such scenes and events, and 1,000 others of the same kind, rise up like mountain tops in my retrospective memory, while others have sunk out of sight like the valleys between? It is because, to use a geological illustration, they have been heaped up by the fiery heat of deep and fervent feeling, which has elevated them from the usual low level of life to cut and to face the sky. We see, then, one way of preserving events in the memory. We may let the mean and the trivial pass away into oblivion, but let us preserve those that are worthy by embalming them in warm feeling. You can often determine what a man is wont to feel an interest in by the objects which he remembers. Suppose a number of persons of different tastes, training, and trades have traveled over the same country in company. You may guess the objects in which they felt an interest by the nature of the scenes remembered by them most vividly. The farmer has a distinct recollection of the soil and of the way in which the land is cultivated. The merchant and manufacturer will rather dwell on the symptoms of advancing or declining trade in the towns and villages along the route. The man of scientific culture can tell you what were the plants and animals of the district and what the structure of the rocks, while he who has a taste for the beauties of nature can never forget those hills and glens and streams of romantic beauty which so kindled his eye as he passed them. The antiquarian delights to describe that ruin covered by the hoar of age, while the man of historic taste will wonder at all the others because they never noticed that plain where a great battle that decided the doubtful fate of a country was fought, or that house which was the birthplace of some patriot or poet. And that plain-looking dwelling, it was not observed at all by the mass of the company, and those who noticed it thought it one of the dullest, stupidest places on the whole journey. But to one man it is one of the kindest and most endeared spots on the surface of this wide world, for that house was his birthplace, associated with his earliest and dearest recollections, recalling the scenes of childhood and the countenances of friends departed from this world, so that the wealthiest cities on the route and the most gorgeous temples and the loveliest of the valleys and the grandest of the rocks and mountains have not had to him half the interest which this place possesses. 2. In parentheses. Those ideas come up most frequently and readily on which we have bestowed the greatest amount of intellectual energy. Children, it is well known, are apt to forget those lessons which they have learned easily, whereas other lessons acquired with greater care cling to the memory. We sometimes see the principle very strikingly illustrated in the case of two boys in the same family, one of whom learns quickly and forgets as rapidly, whereas the other has acquired his task more laboriously, but retains it longer. There were many advantages in the old plan of thorough drilling and disciplining. I have no faith in science made easy, and philosophy in sport. Someone was recommending to Sir Walter Scott a plan of teaching science by cards. You will easily, he remarked, teach them to be fond of the cards. You will have a greater difficulty in giving them thus a taste for the science. I have no faith in those quack teachers who can make you master of penmanship in 12 lessons, or of French in 3 months, or Latin in a 12-month. There is really no royal road to knowledge. The Prince of Wales must learn his mathematics in the same laborious way as the peasant's son. Drilling is a good thing in itself. It is the sole way to make an intellectual soldier. Only the exercise, if not less laborious than it used to be in old times, should be made as interesting and pleasant as possible. There is no help for it. The man who would get to the top must climb the mountain, but there may be some rests by the way, and he may get some pleasant views as he ascends. Young men should not grudge the labor bestowed on a branch of study. It is one of the conditions of their being able to retain what they have got. For it is as true of knowledge as of money, that what is rapidly earned is often as rapidly spent, whereas what is laid up with care and industry is commonly more sedulously preserved. Young men cannot acquire a more valuable habit than that of giving their intellect thoroughly to their business, their reading, their religion. There are many persons who, from neglecting so to discipline their intellects, seem to have lost all power of actively exercising them, and any knowledge they have acquired has passed through their mind like the familiar striking of a clock, or like the walk from their house to their place of business. Their very reading, which is chiefly in novels and romances, is a sort of idleness which gives no robustness to the frame, is often indeed a sort of intoxication which exhilarates without strengthening, and ends in ennui and disgust. Those books are the best, not which think for you, but which make you think. If you have not thought over what you have attained, all your acquirements are like the articles in a lumber room. Some of them may be valuable enough, but they are not at your command. It is when you have thought a book and its subject all over again that it becomes your own, and its thoughts will not only abide in your memory, but be, as it were, incorporated into your intellectual being, to abide with you for strength and for useful application. 3. In parentheses, ideas come up more readily and frequently when they are associated with an act of the will, more especially when we exercise an act of attention regarding them. It is mercifully, as I think, provided that much of what we have witnessed and experienced passes away speedily from the memory. Were this not the case, our minds would be filled with innumerable trifles. We must hear the timepiece that strikes in the room in which we are, but a minute after we cannot say whether we heard it or not. How little does a commercial traveler remember, in ordinary circumstances, of his journey from Manchester to Liverpool, or from New York to Philadelphia, which he has so often taken. It is well that much passes away after this manner, but we must not allow all to vanish in this way, and we have a means of retaining what is valuable. Let us exercise our wills regarding it. Let us direct our attention towards it. We blame our memories when we forget, but there is often a greater culprit than the memory, and that is the heart. We felt no interest in the subject. The party to blame is the will. We paid no attention to it. I know a man noted for his forgetfulness, but it has been remarked about him that he only forgets what relates to his neighbor's interests and feelings. He never forgets what relates to his own. We must all know children who are forgetful enough when we cannot get them interested, but who never forget what is taught them when we can allure them to attend. We complain that we are apt to forget the books we read, the sermons or lectures we hear. Possibly it may not be of great importance to remember all that we have read or heard, but if it is worth recollection, there is a means of fixing it. Our voluntary determinations have a sort of antiseptic power to preserve what they are applied to. Let us, as we read the book, voluntarily recall the topics at the end of every chapter. Let us go over mentally, after it is closed, the sermon or lecture we are anxious to retain in the mind. Or better still, let us take notes of the topics of importance in the book or lecture, and we have got the patent process which will fix forever the colors that might otherwise fade. The question has been asked, how is it that when we form a purpose to do an act at a certain time, we recollect in the multitude of our thoughts within us to perform it? The answer is that we are able to do so only when the resolution has been sufficiently earnest. If formed in a careless way, it may never be executed. We have heard of the young gentleman who forgot the appointment he had made to meet a young lady at a particular hour, whereupon she cast him off, very properly, for if his love had been deep, he would not have been so oblivious. We live in an age in which men know well how to use all sorts of material power, how to use water power and steam power and electric power, and they guide the steam and condense the vapor and place wires to conduct the unseen agency, and all that they may set up incalculable machinery wherewithal to produce nutriment and covering for utility and for ornament. But God has given to every one a lease of a far more important power, that we may guide it into the proper channels and get it up at the proper times and direct it along the proper lines. and all that we may awaken genuine feeling and gather swift knowledge from afar, and go on to useful and benevolent action. But youth, I remark, is the season in which this power is the quickest and the strongest and the most easily directed. In afterlife, we shall be apt to find it already directed in channels from which it cannot easily be moved. And, to change the image, the endeavors you make to get up life will be like the attempts of the birds in October to raise a song. A cheerful note it is in its way, and we do enjoy it at such a season, but it is not like the full chorus of the wood in spring. And such is the activity of youth when it is wisely directed, and all turned into a song of praise to the great Creator. We have thus shown that law reigns in mind as it does in matter. When we know what the laws of matter are, we can take advantage of them and apply them to useful purposes in the arts. When we know what the laws of mind are, we can apply them in the education of the mind. But before closing, I must guard against an impression which may be left when it is proven that the succession of our ideas is governed by laws which operate independently of us. It may be concluded that we have and that we can have no control over our thoughts and feelings, which move and must ever move like the winds of heaven. I have been laboring to give the very opposite lesson. It is because the succession of our mental state is under law that we can command our minds and bring them into subjection. We certainly see many who seem to have as little control over their own minds as they have over the minds of others. They are the slaves of the thought, the impulse, the feeling, the suspicion, the passion that happens to come up at the time or be uppermost. But we have a will, and a free will, given us by God for this purpose, that we may rule our thoughts, and this we can do most effectually when we know what the laws are which our thoughts obey in their order and succession. We cannot, indeed, will into our minds any absent thought, for, as has often been shown, to will it is already to have the thought. If I have forgotten the name of the capital of Japan, I cannot command it to appear. But if I remember any object with which it is associated, I can, by an act of the will, detain this and think of it till what I want comes. I can think of Japan and of the Japanese I have seen till Tokyo comes up by the law of association. It is for this purpose I have been at such pains to expound the laws of association, that as knowing them we may employ and apply them for the proper ordering of all our knowledge, for the formation of good habits, and generally to obtain a thorough command over our minds, a command which we find to be more glorious than that of the general when he has horse, foot, and artillery, all so trained and disposed that they move like the limbs of his body at his will. He that ruleth his spirit is better than he that taketh a city. By thus systematically disciplining our minds, we shall find that we have a greater control over our thoughts than we at first imagined. We shall find that as we habitually repel them, the things that are vain and evil disappear, while the things that are great and good, as we cherish them, remain with us, to talk with us, to instruct us, to elevate us. He who has a mind so stocked and trained is like the traveler who carries his provisions with him. He is in some measure independent of the ordinary accidents of life and the circumstances in which he may be placed, for he can feed, wherever he goes, on the stores he has laid up. End of section 16.